Hello, Wonderhussy here, standing at the side of the road in Death Valley, about to embark on a treasure hunt. That's right, a treasure hunt. So I'm not going to say exactly where in Death Valley I am, because this is one of them there kinds of treasure that folks get real huffy if you give too much information away about the location. And I had to do quite a bit of internet sleuthing to figure out where exactly I'm going. And it looks like I probably found the right path because someone was kind enough to leave this little rock stack or rock cairn to point me in the right direction. Or at least I hope it's pointing me in the right direction. There's not really a trail going to this treasure that I'm looking for. At least, I don't think there's a trail. According to my online research, there might be a very faint youth trail. I guess maybe the closer I get to it. But this is one of those archaeological sites that I guess they don't want people easily finding or knowing about. And so everything about this is a total mystery. And if you know anything about me, you know that the only thing I love more than a mystery is solving a mystery. So even though there was very little information online about how to get to this archaeological treasure, I eventually figured it out, pinned it on my Google map, and downloaded that map so that I could use it to navigate, even way out here in the land of no cell signal. I mean, this place isn't marked on any of the official Death Valley National Park maps, so what could possibly be important enough in the eyes of the federal government to have its location kept such a closely guarded secret? What kind of archaeological treasure do people get that fired up about protecting? That's right, it's petroglyphs. But actually, it's not even exactly the petroglyphs I'm so excited about. It's some other drawings, and oh my gosh, I think I might have actually finally made it! Okay, I'm not 100% sure. I'm gonna have to check my Google map, but I see those kind of reedy looking things growing on the hillside there, and I think that's a spring, or what passes for a spring in this godforsaken, arid, barren landscape. I don't hear any water, but that's probably because it's one of those little tiny seeps in the desert that the white man sucked dry years ago in his endless quest to gouge every valuable ounce of ore out of these mountains. But before the arrival of the white man, I'll bet you anything, there was some kind of pool of standing water here, which would be life-saving for the animals, and it would have been life-giving, life-sustaining to the Native Americans out here. Okay, I know you might think, why would anybody live in a place called Death Valley? Talk about bad branding. Well, no, it wasn't called Death Valley originally. Surprise! The Timbisha Shoshone, which was the Native American tribe who lived in this area, and they did live in Death Valley, even on the valley floor where it's baking, broiling hot in the summertime. They'd come up to the mountains, even higher than here, in the summertime. Anyway, the Timbisha Shoshone did live here very peacefully, apparently, for many years. And apparently, they were the ones who carved these petroglyphs. I mean, normally when you see petroglyphs, you do find them by a water source because that was a sacred place for the Native Americans. And, you know, carving a picture on a rock wasn't exactly something you would just do for shits and giggles, okay? It was very time consuming. It was energy consuming. Remember, the Native Americans, they didn't have agriculture. They spent all day, every day, just scrounging around, especially in this environment, for enough calories to sustain themselves. And so burning any extra calories, chipping away Kilroy was here on a rock, well, they wouldn't have done that unless there was a real good reason and plenty of nourishment around, which there would have been, because if there's a spring, well, that means there's wildlife. Anyway, I digress. Like I said, I'm not actually here to find petroglyphs, even though I do think some of the petroglyphs I've seen are pretty cool. You know, you see the little pregnant sheep, and you see the guy with a spear. Well, I think all those are very well and good, and yeah, I guess I do like petroglyphs, but there's something out here that I think is even more interesting to me anyways than petroglyphs, and I'm looking at it right now. And okay, maybe it's just a sign of my lack of breeding that I don't find an etching like this super duper excited, although I guess it is pretty cool, objectively speaking, that, well, it's like a 5-legged creature or a 4-legged creature with a long dong. You never know. And then what looks like a human figure with a big empty head underneath it. And then in the background, you might be able to see on this other rock here, there's also another petroglyph that looks like, well, to me that looks like a deer. It's got little antlers next to a, gosh, I couldn't tell you what that's supposed to be. But then look to the right of the deer. Looks to me like there's been some white folks here. What does that say? Oh, I think it's L-L-E-R. It looks like maybe it said Miller or Fuller, and the first 2 letters rubbed away. Like there was an I-L-L-E-R. So I'll bet you anything, it was some dude named Miller who carved his name on the same rock as an ancient petroglyph. Ooh, if there's anything that pisses these petroglyph people off, it's some white dude coming in and carving his name right next to a sacred ancient petroglyph. Well, guess what? This particular white dude, we'll just go ahead and call him Miller, and we're going to go ahead and assume it was a he, for reasons I'll get into in a minute. I guess Mr. Miller kind of gets a pass, because this isn't just anybody's name carved on a rock. This isn't just graffiti. This is historical graffiti. In fact, this graffiti is so esteemed that the Park Service goes to pretty great lengths to keep this location a secret. I mean, there was a very faint use trail here and there towards the beginning of the hike, because I guess anthropologists used to come up here all the time back in the days before everybody got so dang sensitive about this stuff. And why would anthropologists be coming up here, you might wonder? Well, that's because there's a whole bunch of names carved on this rock, and I guess that rock too to the right. That's the one that Miller put his name on. Okay, so now you're probably wondering, well, gee whiz, Wonderhussy, why would a bunch of white people come all the way up this random remote canyon to this random remote boulder at the side of a dried up spring just to carve their names in it? Well, it wasn't like this was their destination when they set out, okay? These are relics of the old pioneers that first crossed Death Valley, okay? The first white men. I know there was Shoshone here hundreds of years before any white man set foot in, well, what was then called, gosh, I can never remember what the Native American name for Death Valley was, but it wasn't, newsflash, Death Valley. It was named Death Valley by one of the first women who was dragged across it in a wagon with her screaming babies and hungry husband in search of the juicy, juicy gold fields in California. Okay, I guess some of these original pioneers ended up accidentally crossing this barren landscape on their way from Missouri to California. Now, if you know anything about pioneer history, and if you've been watching my channel for any length of time, well, you should, because I've done a lot of videos about it, like my series on the Donner Party. There was the Oregon Trail that kind of followed a well-established route from watering hole to watering hole, so you never really had to go very long without getting water for yourself or your animals. Well, unfortunately, there was this one group of pioneers that set out, well, they set out from back east like they all did, but then when they got to, I think, Utah, and I made a whole video about this, I just forgot the details, and I didn't know I was going to be coming here today, so I didn't have a chance to brush up, so forgive me if I'm a little bit rusty, but you can go back and watch for yourself my video that I made about the Death Valley 49ers for yourself. And that ought to fill in all the gaps in my memory. Anyway, yeah, there was this group of pioneers in 1849. Okay, 1849, the height of the California gold rush, when every able-bodied man and many women ditched everything to run out west and try to get their share of the sweet, juicy California gold fields. Well, anyway, that's why they were called the Death Valley 49ers. It was a party of pioneers who set out from back east and unfortunately made it as far as Utah when they ran into some guy who told them about a shortcut, which, same thing happened to the Donner Party. Never trust a guy who tells you about a shortcut when you're trying to travel overland across the western United States. Okay, they followed this guy's bunk advice and it ended up taking them right through Death Valley. And that's how Death Valley got its name. Fun fact, like I said, it wasn't originally called Death Valley. It had some spiritual name from the Native Americans, but because these Death Valley 49ers got stuck here for so long, and oh my God, you gotta watch my other video, talk all about it. It was a miserable, horrifying journey. Not that many of them actually died on it, but enough of them did to where when one of the women turned around as she was finally being rescued and leaving Death Valley for good, she turned and waved and said, "Goodbye, Death Valley." And ever since then, well, the name stuck. Or at least it did for most folks. I'm sure the Timbisha Shoshone still call it their ancestral name. Anyway, yeah, apparently this rock right here behind me, this rock bears at least one inscription by one of the original members of that party of 49ers who accidentally wandered into this hostile landscape. And when I say hostile, whoo-wee, I mean, I just showed you what passes for a water source around here. Can you imagine having to cross this whole thing on foot with screaming, crying babies and oxen and hungry, horny husbands? And oh my God, it must have been a nightmare. But such is man's greed for gold and land, or well, maybe just desire for a better life, that yes, they did do it. They came right through here, right through this desolate, lonely ravine. That is, at least some of them came through this desolate, lonely ravine. Okay, if you watched that video I made, they split up when they got down into the valley floor and were hopelessly lost and didn't know which direction to go. They kind of split up into factions, and so the families, the people that were traveling with kids and had like big, cumbersome, bulky wagons, they all split off going one direction with Harry Wade. But then there was a group of young, unencumbered, single men who were traveling west to strike it rich in the gold fields, and then that way they could send for their sweetheart back home and go, "Hey, honey, I've got $1 million in California. Come on out." Well, this group of guys was called the Jayhawkers, and apparently, at least one of them carved his name somewhere on this boulder. That's right, one of the Jayhawkers from the original Death Valley 49ers supposedly carved his name somewhere on this rock. And there are actually quite a few names carved on here. Yeah, they're kind of worn away, but, well, gee, it's been 176 years since 1849. Now, not all these names date from 1849. Like this J. McGuire probably passed through here at a later date because, yeah, while there weren't any other wagon trains that crossed through Death Valley, or at least I don't think there were, that doesn't mean there weren't any other white folk passing through Death Valley. There were still plenty of white men coming out here to gouge all the valuable minerals out of them thar hills. I mean, there's gold and silver all over this place. So over the years, bunches of prospectors passed this way and carved their names into this rock. Looks like there was an L. McGurr. Gosh, it's really hard to read these as I'm filming. I know what's going to happen. I'm going to get home, and while I'm editing it, it's going to be crystal clear as day what that says, and I'm going to look like a real idiot going, L. McGurr. But I don't know. That's what it looks like it says to me. I mean, the guy above him, T.G. Beasley, had much better penmanship, and you can read his name clear as a bell. Somebody was paying attention in penmanship class. Actually, it's really interesting because you can see exactly how this dude, T.G. Beasley, well, I can't say carved, kind of chipped his name into this rock. And apologies for my dang shadow. It's just the way the sun is right now. But you can see The B is just a bunch of little tiny dots that he made by, gosh, I guess sticking a screwdriver. Well, I guess they didn't have screwdrivers back then, did they? I don't know, sticking something sharp in and banging on it with a rock. Very painstakingly. It would not have been an easy process to carve your name into this rock, which is, like I was saying about the Native Americans, you know, it takes a lot of energy and time, even for a white man, to carve even his dumbass name in a rock. Okay, anyway, T.G. Beasley and L. McGurr, neither one of them was a member of the Death Valley 49ers. And we can see this rock has a bunch of, I mean, it looks like somebody came out here in 1937 and scratched RL. I guess somebody whose initials were RL came out here 1937. You guys remember where you were in 1937? Ooh, that was a year. Oh, it was almost 100 years ago. What was that? 88 years ago? Oh gosh, I'm terrible at math. I don't know. What do you think about that? 1937. Is that distasteful? Does that qualify as graffiti, or is that cool and historical? I mean, that's what I think is interesting when it comes to this whole petroglyph discussion. I like seeing stuff like even that 1937, even though, yeah, it's kind of half-assed in its execution. To me, it's interesting to think that some dude back in 1937, 88 years ago, you know, what was going on in 1937? Adolf Hitler was raising a ruckus over in Germany. I mean, it's interesting to me to see a mark left by somebody from that long ago. But I can see where, if you're a purist, you would go, oh, his name is much too modern to be on this rock. Okay, well then what do you think about T.G. Beasley? Is his name old enough to be on that rock? Or is L. McGurr's name old enough to be on that rock? Or is nobody's name old enough to be on this rock other than these Native Americans and their animal petroglyphs? Or their geometric shape petroglyphs? You know, like, where's the cutoff? These are the kinds of questions that keep me awake at night. What year is it when it changes from being historical record to graffiti? I mean, if you found somebody's name carved from 1945, would that be cool? I think so. 1955? I think so. 1965? I think so. 1975, 1985, 1995, now you start getting into murkier waters. You know, I'm just one of those people who likes, oh gosh, I don't even know how to say it, but you know what I mean. I just like pondering these things. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of names written up here, and they're kind of hard for me to read, but it looks like there's some dude named J. Hitchens from 1860. Ugh, I had to put my hoodie on. It's getting a little chilly. Anyway, 1860, I think we can all agree that 1860 is pretty cool and pretty historical, right? I don't know. There's probably some petroglyph purist out there who thinks even that is tacky graffiti. Anyway, next to J. Hitchens, there's Frank Weston. Look, there's one from 1935. Charles K. Your guess is as good as mine, but Charles K., Frank Weston, J. Hitchens, none of those are the one I'm looking for. I'm looking for one in particular who was the member of the 1849 party of Jayhawkers, whose name is definitely 100% for sure carved, if not on this rock, then on one of the rocks next to it. Oh, W.W. McCoy. No, not W.W. McCoy. What's this one? Ooh, look at this guy did a fancy job. J.M.C. Well, this guy must have sat around here for a minute. You know, he even put serifs. Who goes to the trouble of adding serifs to their rock graffiti? He must have been a graphic designer or an artist. Okay, well, golly, I don't see the particular name I'm looking for. I found it! This is the inscription I was looking for. Okay, it doesn't look like much, and you're probably wondering why I'm so excited, but, well, you can maybe see, and the light is kind of challenging, but it says 1849 WBR. Okay, well, according to what I read online, this William B. Rood, I think it was R-O-O-D, carved his name on this rock supposedly in 1849. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, why am I all of a sudden now all skeptical about it? If I hiked all the way up here and I got all excited when I found it, why don't I think he actually carved his name on this rock in 1849? Well, I mean, even though it's not the most impressive engraving I've ever seen, it still took quite a bit of time and effort and energy to do this. So, think about it. By the time the Death Valley 49ers made it this far, they were already in pretty rough shape. I mean, they had already crossed all of the valley floor, and I think it had taken them a couple, 2-3 weeks to get across all of that. And that was rugged, and there wasn't a lot of water, and they were weak, and they didn't have much food, and they had to kill all the oxen and abandon all their stuff. So by the time they made it up here, at least by the time this splinter group made it up here, even though they were young, single, unencumbered men, they were probably pretty worn out, and they didn't have a whole lot of time to sit around, farting around, carving their name into rocks. You know, my guess is by the time they made it up here, they probably just scooped whatever water they could from that miserable looking little spring and then kept going. Because remember, these guys were trying to escape with their lives, okay? They didn't really know where they were going either. Remember, I said the group split up and a bunch of the families went south with Harry Wade, which, oh God, that's a rough journey. But this isn't just as rough of a journey. I mean, you're going up and over in these mountains, and, well, it's maybe not quite as hot as it is down below, but they were doing this in January, okay? The 49ers weren't that dumb. At least they crossed this part of the desert in the wintertime, but that just means it was really cold up here. So these Jayhawkers certainly weren't in any position to sit around carving their names into rocks, wasting time. They needed to push on over these mountains and try to get to California. So if that's the case, if W.B. Roode did not carve his initials here in 1849, then what does that mean? Is this a fake? A fraud? A hoax? Well, no, I guess the generally accepted historical explanation for this little bit of graffiti is that it was actually carved by William Roode, who was actually one of the original Jayhawkers in the 1849 party of white settlers crossing Death Valley. He just didn't carve his name here in 1849. Okay, they think he actually came back here at a later date and carved it. Okay, so now you're probably wondering why on earth a guy who barely escaped with his life would return to the scene of the crime years later and hike all the way back up this miserable, rugged canyon just to carve his name on a rock. Well, I guess it's because all these other dudes carved their names out here, and William Roode was feeling a little bit jealous, I guess. Okay, my understanding, according to what I read online, and again, you can take that with a grain of salt, but I read a lot of blogs about this, is that, like, this guy Hitchens from 1860, I think he was a prospector who had come out here looking for the lost gunsight mine. Okay, there's this legend in Death Valley of the lost gunsight mine. Apparently, one of the original 1849 Jayhawkers lost the sight on his rifle. And golly, it might still be out here to this day. Who knows? Only, well, he didn't say where in Death Valley he lost the sight to his rifle. But he had also picked up a piece of silver ore somewhere in Death Valley. On his journey across this miserable wasteland to get to California, well, he picked up a piece of, apparently a pretty decent sized chunk of silver ore. And so when he finally made it to California, he had that silver ore fashioned into a new sight for his rifle. And he always intended to come back and find that rich silver deposit, but I guess he never made it back here. But the legend spread, you know how miners talk, and so a bunch of people came out here looking for this mysterious lost gunsight mine, which is apparently some big silver lode somewhere out here in the wild and mysterious hinterlands of Death Valley. At least that's my understanding, according to what I read online. So I don't know if this J. Hitchens in 1860 or Frank Weston were out here looking for that mine or another mine. Maybe they were just out here prospecting. Whatever the case, they carved their names on this rock. At least Hitchens did in 1860. And I guess old W.B. Roode was a little jealous. You know what I mean? Like, he kind of wanted to come out here and basically say, "Neener, neener, I was here first." I mean, that's essentially what this is. That's him basically pissing on this rock going, you guys might think you're cool coming here in 1860, but I was one of the original 49ers. And I'm sure there must have been quite a bit of social cachet to have been one of the original Death Valley 1849ers. You know, it was probably like, well, I was going to say it was like being a member of the Donner Party, but I don't think there was any cachet associated with being a member of the cannibalistic Donner Party. But the 49ers, well, they didn't eat each other. They just had a hard time crossing the desert and they made it out alive. And so they were probably seen as something like folk heroes. And so this dude, W.B. Roode, just wanted to sort of stake his claim and make himself known as one of the OGs. At least, according to what I read, that's the assumption. I mean, I guess we don't know 100% for sure that he didn't carve his name here in 1849. It's just exceedingly unlikely. Like I said, it was winter, it was cold, they were hungry, they'd been traveling for quite some time at that point. I mean, remember, they came all the way from Missouri and had probably been traveling even farther than that. So they were exhausted. They really weren't in a position to sit around carving their names on rocks on that first expedition. So it does seem likely that this dude came back years later and did it just to prove a point. You know what I mean? I'd want to prove that I was here before anybody else. It kind of reminds me of a Gary Larson cartoon I saw one time. Remember The Far Side, Gary Larson? Well, it's the astronauts, the very first astronauts that made it to the moon, coming down the stairs of the lunar module, and the one guy's shoving the other guy out of the way so he can step down and go first. Only instead of the surface of the moon, it's Death Valley, which, if you've spent any amount of time in Death Valley, especially down on the valley floor, you know that it doesn't look too different from the surface of the moon. Anyway, that's pretty much all there is to this desolate, mysterious little spring with a rock covered in fascinating inscriptions and petroglyphs. Actually, not just one rock, but many rocks covered in fascinating inscriptions and petroglyphs in this exceptionally remote, desolate, and unnamed canyon in Death Valley.